All right, so I think I'm going to get started. Thank you guys so much. Oops, thank you for coming to the Washington Society's conversation on anti-Black racism in Charlottesville. I'm really excited to have you here, and we have a full panel of really great speakers. My name is Elizabeth. In case you don't know me, I am the diversity chair for the WASH. And a lot of really cool people worked really hard in this panel with the purpose of exploring the historical roots of racism in the Charlottesville community and at UVA. And how it's like continued to this day. The purpose of this panel is also to allow us to learn about ways that we can move forward as UVA students and improve our relationship with the Charlottesville community. So I'm just going to give a quick background on the speakers, and then we'll get started. So our first professor is Professor Claudrena Harold. She is the professor and chair of the Corcoran Department of History here on grounds, where she teaches courses in labor history, African American history, and Black studies. She's published 2 books, co-edited 2 volumes, and co-directed a series of short films on race in America. And in November, she will be publishing her new book, When Sunday Comes, Gospel Music in the Soul and Hip Hop Eras. Our next professor is Professor John Edwin Mason. He teaches African history and the history of photography at UVA. He's also currently writing a book about Gordon Parks, who is an African American photographer, writer, and filmmaker. He's also a documentary photographer and serves on the board of directors of several organizations that serve the photographic community. And in 2016 to 2017, he served as the vice chair of the Charlottesville's Blue Ribbon Commission on Race, Memorials, and Public Spaces, where he made recommendations to the city council about the fate of the Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson statues downtown. Our third speaker is Professor A.D. Carson. He's currently a professor in hip hop and the Global South at the University of Virginia. He's an award-winning artist who has published essays, music, and poetry. And his dissertation, Owning My Masters, The Rhetoric of Rhymes and Revolutions, is a digital archive that features a 34-track album. And it was recognized by the Graduate Student Government at Clemson University for the 2017 Outstanding Dissertation. So our fourth and final speaker is Professor Larycia Hawkins. She's a political science professor, activist, and fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. Her research examines the intersections of race, ethnicity, religion, and politics. So at the Institute, Professor Hawkins' work explores the relationships between race and religions, and she also serves as a scholar on the Race, Faith, and Culture Project and on the Pluralism Project at UVA. And finally, our lovely moderator, Cece Kane. She is a second-year politics major from upstate New York, and here on ground, she serves as chair of STEDCO's Financial Accessibility Committee and the treasurer of our Washington Society. In high school, she was recognized by Siena College and New York State Senate for her leadership and racial equity work. And this past summer, she spent her quarantine as a finance fellow on Cameron Webb's congressional campaign. She also interned at an immigration law firm and organized in her hometown for police reforms and anti-racism work within her town and school system. So as you guys can tell, we have a super stacked panel. I'm super excited. And with that, I'll hand it over to Cece.
All right, thank you, Liz. And thank y'all for being here on this Saturday night. So my first question for our amazing professors is, what does it mean to you all in your separate areas of expertise to be actively anti-racist as professors and to be Black professors at a predominantly white institution? I'm just going to kind of open it up for you to answer, as you will.
That's a huge, huge, huge question, or those are 2 huge questions, and I think maybe we will slip into them gently. But many, many years ago, when I was an undergraduate at the University of Cincinnati, it was still in the wake of the Vietnam War, and people remembered the protests and controversies around the Vietnam War. And I remember one of the history professors who had been at the University of Cincinnati during the height of the protests was talking to us about how he thought his role was in around the Vietnam War and around the controversies, and whether or not he should be out there in the streets protesting. And he said, no, I felt that my role was to be the best historian I could be. And there's part of me that really thinks that in this present moment of Black Lives Matter protests and COVID and the election and the multiple crises that we're facing, that my role is to be the best historian I could be. But there are several buts in there. One is that I find myself increasingly drawn to writing about the United States rather than South Africa. I spent the first part of my career writing about South Africa. South Africa has many similarities to the United States in terms of how race operates in that society. And I always felt like if I was studying South Africa, in a way, I was looking at the United States. I mean, through a mirror, maybe a distorted mirror, but many of the issues were the same. But nevertheless, I find myself increasingly drawn back to the United States. So I am currently working on a project that involves African American history, the essentially the tensions around race in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and through the life of a particular photographer. So, you know, I'm being the best historian I can, but I'm being the best historian on a particular topic. But the other but, there are lots of buts in that sentence. The other but is that, you know, I've been civically engaged. It comes in ebbs and flows. But as the introduction said, I served on the city's Blue Ribbon Commission that made recommendations to the city about what we should do with the Robbie Lee statue and the Stonewall Jackson statue in downtown parks. And that was me thinking that as an historian, I had something to contribute. You know, I had something particular to contribute, a way of looking at the history of the city that comes out of the discipline that I've spent my life pursuing. And so, you know, my professional identity and my civic identity overlapped there. And they continue to overlap. I'm now working with in a multidisciplinary but also multi-institutional project that's looking at the history of Black Charlottesville. And we're looking at the history of Black Charlottesville in cooperation with the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center. And we're using photography to see things, literally see things about the history of the city that haven't been seen or have been forgotten. And so, you know, that line that I heard many, many years ago as an undergraduate about the role of the historian in a crisis is to be the best historian you can be. I mean, I believe that, but I also find myself drawn to particular topics that have to do with race in America.
Thank you so much for that answer. Our next question kind of ties into this, and it's that there are a staggeringly low number of Black tenured professors at the University of Virginia, and one of BSA's longstanding demands and one of the longstanding demands of Black students at this university is to increase that number. There have been allegations in recent years by Black professors who have been denied tenure on the basis of taking an unconventional route to their academic careers or being published only in Black academic journals. And I'm wondering for all of you, do you find that to do justice to the experiences of people of color and to your own experiences, that you must break from these conventional academic standards? And if so, what ways have you done this in your careers?
Wow. So I also would have my friend and student Cece. If you want us to answer, more than one of us to answer a question, let us know, okay? Because I'd be happy to answer the question. I was listening to my colleague, your previous question, and taking, you know, my own notes about what I might say. Can I answer that by way of like
answer either of those questions? Definitely.
Not to take over and moderate your panel, but like there was a pregnant pause, and so I didn't want my dear Cece to think like we're not talking. I just was like taking a breath, like, man, Cece, you get to call on your professors. Like you can say, Professor Hawkins, talk. So because I think it's an important question of like, we are 4 of the Black professors at UVA. I'm not on tenure track to answer your question. And some of us, like, I think as Black folks in a primarily white institution, in academia, which is primarily white, there's a kind of, we find ourselves in grad school with people who have bona fides that we may or may not have. I didn't know about Ford Foundation. My parents both went to college. I did not know about Ford Foundation fellowships. None of my professors encouraged me in that direction. Maybe they didn't know either because they didn't have Black students. So, I mean, it is a different kind of, I feel like it is a different terrain I'll speak for myself, for me. And one of the ways that I think it's difficult to be in academia is that it is the meritocracy. It is neoliberalism on steroids. It is the man. And so I see academia as both, my discipline, I should say, as a prison as well as a prism through which I view the world. I'm a political scientist, I'm a social scientist. And so I'm constantly at the nexus of my discipline and the panopticon that is the university as a prison as well as a prison. The iron, I have a talk called The Iron Cage of the Ivory Tower, right? So when it comes to activism, do you have tenure? Do you not have tenure? Like, it's a legitimate question for a scholar of color to ask themselves. And so for me, I think activism started in a classroom where I realized, as a political science professor, I teach about political science. The goal of government is to do justice in the public realm. Dr. Cornel West says, love is what justice looks like in public, right? Or justice is what love looks like in public, excuse me. And so I find myself at my previous institution, sitting on boards, advocating on behalf of the dignity and rights of labor, and not able to join them on the streets because I'm sitting in a classroom talking about justice and not embodying it on the ground, right? Teaching is, I believe, like my calling in the world. And so I thought, how can I fix this? Because I think as a professor of politics, I believe politics should be relevant. And so I started thinking about, like, well, wedding theory and praxis for me looks like I have to integrate this into my pedagogy. So I started inviting students with me to marches, labor marches, and seeing the ways that the experiential connected for them to the theoretical. And in that way, also, it opened up, it kind of eased, that integration. As a political scientist who teaches at the intersection of religion, race, and politics, and studies those things as well, I'm the subject and object of which I teach. I'm like the repugnant cultural other that I talk about. And I mostly teach white students, majority culture kids, right? And so how do I navigate that? How do I negotiate that? Like, activism becomes a way of bridging those parts of myself, of being embodied, of not just being here, but also living out those things which I teach. I see teaching as a form of accountability, to be the person in the streets that I profess to be in the classroom. So that's how I see it. And I think that does relate to tenure, because that makes you dangerous. I had tenure before, and I would gladly do what I did that facilitated the end of my tenure again, because it was about embodying solidarity with the least and the last and the lost. And if academia won't have me in a tenured position, well, I'll teach in other ways. If that's the price of embodied activism flowing out of a wellspring of, yes, theory and lived knowledge, then that's the price. And I'll teach in other ways and in other places, so.
I think to the question about I think both of these things, the answer, my responses to both questions are related. Hip hop has been around probably, before August 11th, 1973, in 1520 Sedgwick Avenue in the South Bronx. But people have been teaching about hip hop and around hip hop or through hip hop since the very beginning, at least the early 80s. And it seems odd to me that some of the things that I've done on my way to UVA as a stop, as a career, that, in 2017 or in 2020, you could still be doing something that is the first. And that doesn't say anything exceptional about me or my work. It says something that is incredibly lacking within these institutions and the ways that they might use these cultural products and use the labor and the creativity of particular people in order for other folks to be able to benefit from it, like folks who might be writing books about hip hop but working in different departments, and the folks who are writing raps, who are performing raps, who are, like these folks kind of get left out, or whenever they're brought along as add-ons, and their work is really, really important to what folks have been teaching since the 1980s. And so I think that it's important for me as a professor who's not, I'm not a hip hop studies scholar. I'm a rapper. And it's important that folks get that straight, that hip hop studies is a discipline and there are a lot of folks in it and they are doing important work. And what I do might be related to that work that they're doing, but my work is about a lot of different things. I'm not rapping about the history of rap. I'm not rapping about the history of hip hop studies. I'm more likely to rap about the history of the university that we're at, or, some things that might happen in the town where I live, than I am to try to articulate the history of hip hop or hip hop studies. And that's a little different. And so, I just released an album called I Used to Love to Dream. And it has the distinction of being the first rap album ever peer reviewed for release with an academic press. So that might be a problem for folks who might evaluate a tenure file for me, because, well, number one, who are the peers who are doing the peer review? Number two, who are the folks that are going to be evaluating this file, and what are they going to be listening to? And how will they know if they heard it? How will they know if it's relevant, if my peers are all excluded from participation in the way that I get to participate? And how would it be fair for this institution to ask those people who can't work where I work, how I work, to evaluate this file, to tell them whether they should keep me on or not? And it's really complicated. But also, I don't look to UVA for validation. Having a job at UVA is not what made me dope. And it's not the thing that I use to measure my dopeness, against whatever else is out there. And in a lot of ways, it might have affected it negatively. And I'm having to work with that and work against that. And if UVA is not going to do whatever it needs to do to make sure that I am able to continue to do the work that I do here, I'll do that work somewhere else. Because again, like, validation from UVA or any institution, or from even the place where I, did my doctoral work, that wasn't the thing that I was seeking. It was to obtain the bad document in order to get into the room that I wanted to be in order to affect that room in the ways that I believe what I do should and can affect those rooms. And so that means that I have to be honest, and I have to show up as the person I know myself to be. And that might change over time. But as long as I'm doing that self-evaluation and that reflection, then that is going to give me hope that the transformative work that needs to happen in the classroom is happening, because I'm also not suppressing parts of myself in order to exist in this place, or to make the people who are in the room comfortable, or to make the people who are in you know, like the college offices or, you know, the folks who are on the board of trustees or whatever, their discomfort is not my problem. And so I don't treat it as something that, yeah, it's just not a thing that I allow to live in my head.
Yeah, I'll just sort of respond, I guess, briefly. You know, I think a lot of things are biographical in some ways. And, you know, grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, in a predominantly Black community. Attended a Catholic school that was like 1st through 8th grade, 99.999% Black. But I attended Temple University and was in African American Studies. And so some of these questions just were not even on our radar. And I thank God for that, to be honest with you. For example, I'm sort of glad the category of anti-racist wasn't on our radar, because sometimes I'm not sure that framework is capacious enough to capture the freedom dreams of Black people. And what I mean by that is I think it's important to have a curriculum and a teaching style and to engage the history of white supremacy and whiteness, to deconstruct, but perhaps in reconstructing, we have to go to the freedom dreams and the ideas about justice that emerge from other communities, right? And so when I approach questions in terms of teaching, I'm constantly thinking, well, what did those Black intellectuals at Virginia Union do during the 1920s? Or what did those newly free Black people, what were they thinking about in terms of freedom and education and the role of education in society? Quite frankly, those are not answers. Those are not questions that I can find answers if I just look specifically at the history of UVA. And so I just want to say that because my approach to what it means to be a professor, what is the vocation of the Black scholar, what's my responsibility at a, you know, historically white university, is just not, it's governed by growing up in Black studies or going to school in Black studies in the 1990s. And we just had a completely different set of questions. And I think it's also important to note when you think about that moment that Professor Mason talked about, the late 1960s, the 1970s. I mean, some of the people at Temple were professors who emerged in that moment. And so I'm thinking about the first time I ever went to New York was on a bus with Sonia Sanchez. She would always take her students to Schaumburg every semester. And so I wasn't even in her class. So I say that to say that if you were doing African American studies in the 1990s, and whether it be Temple or UVA, you were oftentimes trained by people who had a different conception of what is the role of education in society. And so when you begin to talk about even conventional academic standards, some of us were just not thinking that way. That was not a vocabulary that we necessarily had. Because to get back to that question or to get back to Sonia Sanchez, her question is always, but does it free you? And so that's what some of us, not all of us, were sort of thinking about. And so you're emerging in that formation of Black studies, you're emerging in that formation of hip hop. And so I think it also shapes your approach. So to be perfectly honest with you, I wanted to be the kind of teacher that my professors at Temple were. I wanted to be the kind of teacher that Miss Lewis, my 3rd grade teacher, when my dad died and my mom was like, I still gotta work, she picked me up. She would come to the hospital where my mom was working and she'd take me to school. So it's like, to put that into context, when you say, okay, Professor Harold, can you come here and talk at 6:30 on a Saturday? That's something I feel like I'm supposed to do. So that's why in some ways too, I struggle with this language now of amplify me, pay me, do this, do that. I mean, that's all good, but that's not the tradition from which I come. So for me, as a professor, I'm trying to do that work. I'm trying to cultivate my students' imagination. I'm trying to be the best historian that I can be. I'm trying to be the best Black studies scholar that I can be. I'm trying to work within the context of community and my local resources. So one of the reasons I got into the history of African Americans at UVA, quite simply, was I was just trying to be a better teacher in the Intro to African American Studies course. And I just noticed that when I talked about the local, students kind of paid attention. And so, but that was no different than what I was learning at Temple when they were trying to figure out, how do we deal with this university that's gentrifying and buying up, you know, parts of North Philly, and we got a Black mayor, and all of this is happening. And so that approach shaped how I thought about these questions. And that approach shaped how I sort of function in this particular space. And so I'll just leave it there. But I think you know, it's important to know it's important to understand people's formations, you know, and the intellectual spaces from which they emerge, and the kind of questions that they put forth. And so when I came into this space, I'm also trained by people who had a little bit to do with SNCC. So if you go back to 1964 and the students go to Mississippi, and there were some basic questions. What does the dominant society have that we want? What does the majority society have that we don't want? What do we have that we want to keep? And like, that's kind of, you know, how I'm thinking and how I'm governing things. So I'll be quiet and yeah.
No, but if I can hop in, because I think that some of this is also like, I don't know how to be a Black professor without carrying my culture to the classroom. You know, I always remind my students, like, my first experience of anti-Black racism, since that's the category, is kindergarten. I knew I was in the bus kids group. I knew in first grade that my teacher hated me because I was the only Black child at this white school, right? So I don't know. Somehow, though, I take care of my Black students. I'm teaching majority white students. I don't mostly have Black students in political science classes. I mostly have white students. And somehow, at the place that I got tenure, my first evaluation is she especially mentors students of color. I was like, biatch, no, I especially mentor white students because those are the organic relationships I've got, because that's who's in my classroom. And yes, I mentor Black students and other students of color as a big sister, as a, you know, I got you. Even though the majority of my time at a liberal arts college is teaching 6 classes a year and, you know, mentoring inside the classroom and outside the classroom with the students that I'm mostly in concert with. And then what Dr. Harold said becomes a liability with regard to your tenure. This is my point, right? So we do the things that are natural in the context of our communities is, you know, nobody cries for us, we cry for us. Nobody dies for us, we die for us. We look out for us and for others, right? So we're still caring for others. And we do this for the love. I know Professor Harold does this for the love of students, of all students. And so it is incumbent upon me to remind my students that my own enslaved ancestors came in on all of my sides, Point Lookout, Maryland, Richmond, Virginia. And I had a student say to me, I never noticed the monuments, right? And so like recontextualizing like in this place and how all of this also plays into one's ability to embody those values, those communal values, which are part of the tenure package, right? Like you have to be a good citizen of the UVA community, a good citizen of Charlottesville, which I know we're interested in talking about, well, what does that look like? If you get too loud, if you show up to too many marches, and then this also affects your tenure at Mr. Jefferson's university. So.
Wow, thank you all for those answers. And I think that spoke so beautifully to why we need people with diverse cultures teaching us music. We need artists teaching us music and activists teaching us about cultural evolutions. And I think the fact that we're even in a time in which it's in some places possible that Black people can fit into these academic spaces and take up space and not conform to the typical structures that they're meant for, it really speaks to the time that we're in. And it's a revolutionary thing. And Professor Hawkins kind of brought me to my next question in terms of statues and recontextualizing monuments that we have. And recently, the University of Virginia's Board of Visitors decided to remove and recontextualize several of the statues on grounds, especially for the history professors that we have on the call today. Could you talk about one interesting piece of history or culture at UVA that students may not know about, but is relevant to understanding the space that we take up and the environment here? Or if anyone just has any thoughts on sort of the recontextualization of statues here as a first step, and whether or not that's enough to do at the university.
Professor Mason, I think you might be muted.
Yes, I was. Yeah, when I started answering your first question, I said that it's a big question, and maybe we'll slip into it slowly. And by that, I was hoping my colleagues would come rescue me, which they have done really nicely. I was really moved by what I just heard. I don't think I have a little tidbit about history of the University of Virginia. You know, I certainly encourage each and every student to read what's been written and published lately about this city and this university. And I'll give a special shout out to Charlottesville 2017, which was co-edited by Claudrena and has an essay in there by me. I think it's a great way to start thinking about this university. But I'd also say, look, the report of the President's Commission on Slavery at the University is available free online. You can download the PDF. It's very readable, and it will tell you things about the school. But you know, when you start talking about memorials and statues, I start thinking about the landscape here at the University of Virginia. And the landscape always has me thinking about how deeply embedded our origins are in the institution. You know, this university that is built on land that was taken from the Monacan people, this university that's built on land that was leveled by enslaved people, and where we study and sometimes live in buildings that not only were built by enslaved people, but also housed enslaved people. And yet that history was hidden for a very long time and remains mostly invisible. And what we have is this landscape where the labor and the wealth that was created by enslaved people is really just not seen. And what's seen is the surface. The surface is this plantation-like academical village that's in so many ways a celebration of whiteness and white supremacy. And, you know, I applaud the recent edition of the Memorial to Enslaved Workers. I think it's a fantastic thing. And every time I visit it, I personally am profoundly moved. But I don't think it changes the essential landscape of this place. And I don't think that all the reports that have been written, the books that have been written, and even the kind of teaching that we do here has made much of an impression on the essential structure of this university. This university remains, in so many ways, what it was for a long time, an intellectual home of white supremacy. And as much as I would like to believe it can someday become an intellectual home of justice, it's not that yet. And, you know, when I think about things like the statues and the landscape, I think about how intractable and how embedded our origins are at this university. And yeah, I'll leave it there.
You know, I'm really I'm struggling with this moment in some ways because you know, I teach in Now, and Now is actually located you know, adjacent, really planted on a gravesite of a free Black community. And if you go there, you can learn about, you know, Catherine Foster. And I was just reading an article from 1993, you know, when all of that was going on, and when, you know, this discovery was made, and this and that. And so it's interesting to be in this moment where there's been this long conversation about monuments. And I also, you know, I can remember some of those students from 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, that were pushing for more than just that little, you know, slab of concrete near the rotunda that honored the, you know, enslaved laborers at the university. And I think with COVID-19, it's also hard to really know and to really see what kind of space that will, you know, that will be. I mean, I think we've seen some cases or some instances. And so when I say I'm struggling with this moment, when we talk about, you know, sort of the white supremacist structure, and then you know, you sort of fight to create new spaces, you fight to create new teaching opportunities. And I should say, some of these new courses do a lot better than the traditional courses. So I also want us to kind of understand, like, in this moment where all of these alternative histories are also some of the most popular classes on grounds. I'm struggling to make sense of also what all of that means and how much it carries. And also understanding that if we keep doing this work and it's still not enough and you're still getting tired, you know, how long do you also stay in this space? That becomes the next question. So the next, the question, and that's a tough one, but that's something that I kind of wrestle with. When you sort of do that work, but there's still kind of this dialogue, you know, about, you know, the monumental landscape and, you know, what will progress look like? I mean, what will it look like? What's the criteria? And so I've been feeling that I've been feeling that for the past like 4 or 5 months. Like, you do certain things and it's still not enough. So yeah, what does freedom look like? You know, and that's not really the answer to the question that you raised, but I think we have to get there. I also would say we have to be, what I would want us to be kind of mindful of in this effort to teach about the history and the monuments. And I was hearing someone talk about, you know, the importance of, say, going to Monticello and talking about the landscape. Well, that's actually traumatic to a lot of people of color. And I understand that desire to go and think about the built environment is also emerging out of the disciplinary protocols of architecture. So also, like, there's this interest in understanding the landscape, and we want to understand white supremacy, and we want to know about Vinegar Hill and Gospel Hill. No, is that about your disciplinary project? And then what can happen is sometimes students can get caught in that, and you don't even know what's going on. So I would say in this moment, we also have to be very clear about what do we want? As progressive students, as Black students, as what do we want? Because I also see just some of this stuff just going in all kinds of directions. So, yeah, what do we want? We want to talk about aldermen. We need to know, okay, we want to get rid of all, okay. But then what does that mean where there are students on grounds that don't know who Carter G. Woodson is or Luther Porter Jackson? I mean, like, what does freedom look like? What does a liberatory education look like? Anyway, yeah, sorry.
I want to say something really short, and then I'll give my colleagues a chance. And I just want to jump on something that Claudrena just said. You asked, what does change feel like, or what does freedom feel like? I can't remember just how you put it, but let me tell you that one thing that I don't feel and have never felt at UVA, I've been here for 25 years, is I've never felt like this is my place, right? I've never felt not alienated. You know, I have never felt a sense of ownership at UVA. And I think that one of the things that change will feel like, if I can be in Now Hall, or if I can be walking across grounds and I can feel like this is my place. But it's never felt like that. You know, UVA has always felt like this is my employer. This is who pays me. And, you know, I have felt emotional attachment to colleagues and students for sure, but not to the institution. There's always been alienation between me and the institution.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a historian, and so perhaps the question is not for me. But one thing that I do notice is one thing that I notice, and I try to challenge wherever I am, is the way that we exist in language, and because we exist in language, and most of it is inherited, then I think that we accept and we pass along certain things that we don't question because we don't question the language. And so while some people might find it odd, it's just like, well, you don't call your campus a campus, or you do call your campus a campus as opposed to something else, or an academical village. Then I think that, like, some of this, like the history comes into conflict with the present moment because of the way you articulate what's happening that you're trying to get out of. And for that reason, or for reasons, related to that, I think of language, or certain, like, elements of our language as kind of invisible monuments to pasts that we're trying to get out of. And I think that lots of times we have to meet the moment with the language that is going to make it accessible. But I think that what hip hop has always done, and not just hip hop, so many expressive arts have worked really hard to transform the language so that when we speak about the thing, I mean, like, think about a word like bling and what it might have meant before and what it means now, and how that's something that we've been able to transform so that when everybody's speaking about it, it is hardly ever unrelated to what Lil Wayne and the Hot Boys did. Hardly ever unrelated to that. Or someone making a gesture like brushing their shoulder off, or talking about swagger. And so I think that there's something that I've noticed about the language at UVA that continues to bind us to the history that we're all sort of working out about and around, or trying to subvert. But and I remember that, like, coming to a protest and then making note of the fact that the students who were doing this incredible work about the history we're still engaging in the language that was inherited here. And so, like, what do you mean, or what are we saying if we say these are our grounds? Or what are we saying, like, when we talk about, I mean, like, in the same way that we might talk about the language in the Constitution, but if we're questioning the language in the Constitution and saying that it's not true, but then we offer it as a truth statement, is it still not true? Or do we believe in it only for the moment of our trying to push back against it? And I think that our ability to examine that is really important if we are going to speak new realities, new futures into existence, because we have to be mindful of the language that we've received and the ways that we want to be in language going forward. And so sometimes it's maybe just saying, what do you mean when you say grounds? Like, what does it mean to you? Because I know folks are saying it like interchangeably, but what's different about it than something else that you might say to describe the place where you are? And I think I do this with the names of buildings, so so that I'm not in this situation of having to say, well, I didn't know that this building was named for, you know, an enslaver or, you know, a human trafficker. So, you know, like, I'll describe the building in terms that folks will understand. And then when someone asks, well, why don't you call it what people call it? And I'm like, well, I don't know enough about it to call it that and be all right with it. But like, I do, like, I mean, I've learned what, you know, what these things are called. So anyway, I'll just say that because I believe that it's something, at least, that I might have to offer as a rhetorician.
Mm.
I also, related to that, I often talk about, I'm in academia, and the first time I heard all that architectural stuff, and I went to a university with a top 10 architecture program about the built environment and the da-da-da-da-da, was at UVA when I came here. And I like to talk about Sally Hemings' Ghost, because that is more important to me. Like what we, for instance, so to your point, I hear Professor Mason when he says, I feel alienated here. I never felt like I belong here. Actually, as a Black academic, that's how I want to be. I never want to fit in here, actually. This is not my place. I don't want ownership, because I also don't like that language of capitalism, that notion, because, you know, Ubuntu and the places that my people are from and the ways that I've been taught to think in my own formation from my own experience with Black Christianities, various Christianities, and what it means to be Black and to descend from a diaspora and know not exactly from whence you come until your aunt does the DNA test. And then to last weekend go to the mountain where my descendants are from 2 hours from here. And know that the wake that I came in on down the road here, I mean, like, to inhabit space is different than talking about the built. There's an objectification that I cannot embody, right? I can objectify it, I can talk about it academically, but I'm also, when I talked about being the object and subject, I'm living this daily. I'm living, as Professor Harold talked about, the trauma as a professor, as I'm teaching my students about these things. So how do we talk about monuments and statues? Because what I think is happening then, to Dr. Harold's point, is that all of a sudden, it's just like when universities got the VP of diversity and thought they were done. You know, we did that thing. We get rid of Thomas Jefferson, we're done. Well, his house is still sitting up on the hill haunting our bodies here. So, I mean, there are all of these ways that I think being a Black professor at UVA in specific, and I was at a very white, conservative liberal arts institution before I came here, the burden is not less, it's just different. It's burdened by the history of the founding of this country and our inability to come to terms with the fact that, like, again, Professor Harold said, anti-Blackness isn't the thing, it's like, are we free? And so I find myself as a professor asking my students, we can't be free until we glimpse our common humanity. And so I'm interested in asking my students who you be and who you becoming, Because if we can't figure that out, we can't be free. And so liberation in some sense also begins with, yes, imagination, but also knowledge of self and place. And our students walk around stressed out about their 18 hours and not thinking about who they are in the context to the work that they're doing and the supposed career path that they have laid out before them. And yeah, and TJ just wants their money back when they graduate. That and, you know, whatever, send you off and then make sure to give back to the Alumni Society. So second years can have those dinners like you did, so.
Thank you all for such thoughtful answers. I think I'll probably prompt 2 more quick questions so we can have time to get to Q&A, but I think you all kind of got to a lot of really important things in the answers that you gave already. And Professor Harold, when you were speaking, it kind of reminded me of a question that I had about the literal labor that you're all doing as professors at the university and the emotional labor that it can be to teach about Blackness here and to take up space in Charlottesville at all. And I'm wondering, because a lot of times in racial equity work, there isn't a quantifiable payoff for people, how you all celebrate those wins as they come and how you kind of keep doing this work in a sustainable way.
Oh, well, maybe I'll respond to this. I think that I mean, like, I think I said this before, but yeah, like because I don't think I didn't take like a different path to becoming a professor. I didn't think that it wasn't a thing that I expected, or it wasn't a thing that I expected in this way. I think that there were things that I was doing that I was really interested in, and the entire time I always made music, no matter what it was. And so it was, you know, like as a response to the emotional toil of like living in the world and being worried about my nieces and nephews, my mother and my pops and my uncles and aunts and whatever else was going on. When things happened, I wrote about them. And I think that I was kind of lucky in a lot of ways to find in that a path to doing what I'm doing. I think that so this question that you're asking is a question that I ask myself. I think that the question that I ask is like, is it really a win when your team ain't there? Try to get you some sleep and your dreams ain't there. And I do. I pose the question to myself, but I think it's knowing who my people are and trying to find who those people are here, and even while being here, trying to create community in the spaces where my students are working, so that so that they feel connected to each other and they have a place where they don't have to feel on all the time. And I think that for me, the celebration comes in those moments when they realize something about how they're connected to one another through a project that they're working on, or that the project, doesn't feel like work to them. And then what they've taken on is a kind of a way of being in the world that I experienced before I came here, that I know that I would do if I wasn't here. And so when I'm making music, I'm writing an album, it's not because I need to put an album out to get tenure, or that I need to write a thing to get tenure. That's the way that I would be doing this even if I wasn't here. And so I feel fortunate to be able to do it and it be part of, like what we call work. And it's also what I call my teaching. It's what folks sign up to get whenever they're signing up for my classes. And when the folks who are part of that community are able to let off all of those other expectations and then express whatever they're expressing, or to be able to connect with whoever they're, you know, like the people who they're with. That's a thing that really feels like a win to me. And that is sometimes really, really difficult to get people to take a risk and say something that they are feeling, or say something that they're worried about, or, you know, be vulnerable with themselves or be vulnerable with other people. You can go a whole semester and not have a class do that. And so when that does happen, I feel like that's, you know, the most tangible kind of win for me.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I really like my job. And it brings me a lot of joy, to be perfectly honest with you. And that's why, you know, sometimes when there are other opportunities, I have stayed here. I really enjoy what I do, and I consider myself, you know, blessed. That doesn't mean I didn't make mistakes. That doesn't mean that I didn't make some left turns when I should have made some right turns. But I think I benefited from the existence also of an African American community within this space. I benefited from the fact that I could be in history and African American studies, and because of the efforts of other people, I could go teach an intro to African American studies at UVA and have 120 people. When I know I have friends at other places that struggle to have, you know, struggle for courses to fill up with 20 people. There's something interesting about this place in that sense. When I got here in 2004, and I think this gets also to the Black student experience, this is a place where, you know, the BSA has celebrated its 50th anniversary. Most of the Black Greek organizations have celebrated their 40th or 45th anniversary. So for people, I think, entering this space in the 2000s, there was a sort of infrastructure of a Black UVA. And that doesn't mean that I thought UVA was Temple, let me be very clear, or Virginia Union or Hampton down the street. But also there was a way in which the history of Black UVA and the people who build it, if I studied those people, it would often lead me back to those places. So it was a blessing to be a part of intellectual work that I didn't have to stay here and sit here long. And so I just, yeah, so that, you know, and then when I started doing some of the film work on the history and the Black experience at UVA, it was just fascinating stories that just drew me in, that, you know, learning about people who were just so fascinating. And so, yeah, there's a lot about the job that just, and that's not to say that there are not issues, there are, but there's a lot about the job that brings me deep joy. And I do feel obligated to make sure that people understand that. But I also feel obligated to be very honest about maybe the particularities of certain experiences that enable you to kind of enjoy that. So it's also how you experience UVA is also shaped by the communities that you are rooted in. And I think that's, you know, that's extremely important to sort of know. And, you know, earlier, and I just want to say this really brief, earlier you asked me, for example, about this place that students should know about that they maybe don't know about. And the last film, well, it's not the last film, but one of the more recent films that Kevin Everson and I did was called Black Bus Stop. And it's kind of an iconic spot on grounds that African-American students in the 1970s and the 1980s started hanging out. And by the 1990s, when the Black student population was at its peak, it was not uncommon for like 300 people, 400 people to be there. Interestingly enough, in 1997, the university stopped the bus route during the fall semester very briefly because some people complained that it was an eyesore. And so to me, like, that captures all of the, you know, kind of the complexity in the history. But I also bring this up because recently, you know, with this conversation about reimagining the landscape and thinking about the landscape, and I think now they're going to put some kind of plaque out there. And I was a part of, you know, writing some stuff. And it's just kind of weird too, because also you're honoring a space that was so iconic at a particular moment that no longer exists. So I also think about, what does it mean to honor the Black bus stop, a space that you had hundreds of Black students having a good time hanging out in the 1990s, in a moment or in a decade when there were more Black students here than there are now. So like some of the, also, and that gets to the question of some of the, you know, the emotional tug of war that I feel about this moment is like sort of honoring this space, but also understanding that some of the people that are interested in honoring this space have no idea or no interest in the people and the cultural patterns that contributed to that space, right? It's just also just kind of a part of their monumental fascination right now. And so, yeah, I just wanted to kind of bring that up.
Thank you so much for those responses. And my final question kind of roots us back in Charlottesville. As UVA students, you know, oftentimes we mean well, but we do cycle through this community every 4 years. Then sometimes don't always consider the long-term residents of Charlottesville and the sustainable work that they do here. In my short time, I've seen students start projects that die when they leave, or take attention and resources away from already existing projects in the broader community. And I'm wondering if any of you have any particular ways UVA students can be more meaningful and have more long-lasting contributions to this community that go beyond performative work.
Yeah, I'm going to say something that might sound a little strange, but I think it's important for students to be connected to the city of Charlottesville and to the community. And I think it's important for them to do that through some sort of vehicle that's not connected to UVA and where you're not surrounded by other UVA students. And, you know, one of the, I tell students who are looking to answer the question you just asked is, join a church, join a synagogue, go to the mosque, right? Get away from UVA, get away from other UVA students, you know, find a real community institution to join in, and then just go and be quiet and listen and get to know people. I mean, that's, to me, that's always been the most successful way. And, you know, of course, there are other ways of doing it besides, you know, joining a church, a synagogue, a mosque, or whatever you would do. But I think that that is a kind of a model that students might be looking for. Where can I find people doing things in Charlottesville that I'm interested in, where UVA students are radically outnumbered by people who live in the city and county?
I can answer by way also of the last question, which, like, I think one of the ways that, and a student asked a question on the chat too, the fulfillment, the demands, emotional labor, and otherwise, that honestly, majority culture professors don't carry the emotional labor, the literal labor, the being asked to be on a panel by students of color and always saying yes, because it is a form of carrying on our descendants' legacy. And I see it that way. But it also comes with the knowledge of colonial trauma. Like, I talk about this place all the time because I cannot help but be haunted by the ghosts, the ways that this place is lauded as the center of liberty. And it is the spoke. I mean, a lot comes out from this spoke. So as a political scientist, I want my students to understand the importance, not just of Charlottesville itself, but of Virginia, you know, the 1619 Project, like our proximity, right, to the ideals of liberty and justice and radical egalitarianism, and the brutal ways that that has played out in in our history and continue to play out in our history. And so when I think about this question about this student asking, like, is it worthwhile to try to fit in here? Do we need a place? Do I need a place? I don't need UVA's hospitality. I don't need white people's hospitality. I don't need academia to do what I do. But this is how I've been trained. This is an institution in which I can share my gifts and mentor, yes, students of color and white students, and tell them, yes, I love you and I care about who you are and who you're becoming. And I ask you that all the time, because if we're ever to get beyond the performativity of taking down statues or renaming buildings, there has to be intentional presence. And to Professor Mason's point about how you contribute back to the Charlottesville community, I don't ever want to feel home at UVA. I don't ever want to feel at home anywhere. Because in my own faith tradition, my own religious tradition that I have been imprinted upon by, my people are people who are always on the outside. They are oppressed. And that is my position, my positionality here. And the perspective of the oppressed has changed my life. I don't ever want to be at the center of power, the pinnacle of power. And that's how I see UVA, like this grasp for the kind of power that comes from networking with the right people, taking the right classes, majoring in the right thing, getting the right internship. And so what I don't want to do is be so obsessed with being at the center of this iron cage that is the ivory tower that I lack the perspective to see beyond the strictures of the prison that is my discipline. And so how do scientific revolutions happen? How do revolutions happen? They don't mainly start at a university like UVA. It ain't gonna start here, but it will start with students taking Professor Carson's class and Professor Mason's class and Professor Harold's class and my class, because what I believe we offer is embodiment, real embodiment of an experience of otherness vis-a-vis the power structure otherness, but it's the perspective that we need as a country to move on. Most of our students have never had to submit themselves to a person of color. Most of my white students have never had a Black teacher in their lives. And it either changes you or it doesn't. You're given a mirror, and do you walk away the same or do you walk away different? When I come on Zoom and I'm sharing with you from my personal perspective, when my voice is shaky, even when I'm speaking with colleagues and students that I love, because this is existential for me. This is existential for my nephew. This is existential for my students of color. I hope you learn about political science from me, but what I hope is you learn to become more human, that on the other side of COVID, you are more human, not less human. And if all you learn from me is how to see the person next to you as formed of the same primordial clay, subject to many of the same, external vagaries, but as a person in a particularized, oppressed position, the precarity that comes from my body being in the street and my majority culture students' bodies in the street, and then their work is done. Like, what we need is students willing to submit themselves to the authority and the perspective of those who are living this shit. That's how we learn, and that's how I educate myself. I learn to become more human by speaking to people who are forgiving one another after genocide. That's how I learn. And I learn from my students. I learn from your eagerness. I learn from your willingness to be vulnerable in class. Your willingness to sit under a professor and ask hard questions about race. It is my job to teach you, and it is a joy, as Professor Harold said. It's a joy, and it is my calling. And it's also my calling to challenge you, to change the place. Don't settle for, as Professor Carson taught me, I wrote it down. Like, we exist in the language. We got to change the language, or at least the way we speak about the language. So, so yeah, I love my students. I love teaching at UVA. I do. But I cannot be inured to the goodies of academia. I've had them. That's not my identity. But being in solidarity with you is, and I'm very hopeful about your generation. Every day I teach is a day of hope because of y'all. So.
I think I want to add about, you know, with things that, well, I'll say it. So with the previous question about what you might do to have something like that, or a relationship, something that's other than, I believe the word was performative. When I came here, when I was asked to come here, I asked if I could, like, how soon could I get to town? Because I come from Central Illinois, and it's a small liberal arts school there. Shout out to Millikan University. But one of the things about that university was that I remember being a member of a hip hop community in Decatur, Illinois, and how that community was always overshadowed and kind of like boxed out and removed from any kind of resources because of the university. And then when the university wanted to say that it had a relationship with the town, what they would do is they would call up a few rappers and be like, can you come perform at this show? But the weekly ciphers happened at the Rap Shack on El Dorado Street. The music that came out on Tuesdays, you were going to get all of like the underground hits at GB's Records and Tapes. And you would be able to see a cipher at the skating rink. And there's no, like, there was nobody at the university who was doing what I do currently that was interested in coming out to, that was the name of the place. It just closed. And also, like, RIP to the, you know, like the record stores, because it was like an independent record store that closed down on the last day of 2019. But the fact that folks from the university weren't interested in hip hop culture in town, they were interested in having folks from the town like kind of decorate their hip hop conference whenever they put one on, or whatever performance they were doing. So when I came here, I wanted to come, as Professor Mason said, I wanted to come and go to the weekly or monthly show and listen and buy whatever merch people had and learn who was doing what, and not make the moment of my being there about me. And it's about like what hip hop sounds like in Charlottesville, because then I'll have an idea of what it sounds like. And what I've recognized with my students sometimes is that the thought about what hip hop is where you are is just about what hip hop happens at UVA. And as Professor Harold says, that, well, if you start to look back at the history, like what actually happened here, you'll find that not hip hop at UVA, hip hop culture was affected by things that happened at UVA, by people who were students at UVA, or people who had relationships with people in Charlottesville. And so, you know, if you know like particular rappers or producers through time, and then folks are like, oh yeah, it was like that time when Big Daddy Kane and Biz Markie came down for, you know, this weekend where a lot of Black students were invited to, you know, like to campus. And it's like, hold on, like Big Daddy Kane and Biz Markie were here? And I think it's really important to know that the reason that there is a separation between the community and, you know, like culture on campus is not because like they don't go together. A lot of these things are deliberate. And so it's up to, you know, you as students to try to reconnect with that in some way. And so, I mean, that's something that I try to practice myself, or that I want to practice myself. But I think that that's something that can be done. If you're interested in hip hop, there is a scene in Charlottesville, there's a scene in Richmond, or there's, I mean, you know, I mean, this whole like mid-Atlantic region, you can go, and it's not like like traveling to like some big festival, there are weekly and monthly shows where you might be able to, you know, connect with folks who are up and coming, but you don't know that unless you go there. And it can't be a thing that you're using to dress up the thing that you're doing on campus just to make it look like community engagement. Because I think that folks know that. They peep that and they say, I want to come because like I want this check, or I want that platform, and I do want to network. But I don't think that that creates trust. It's a transaction. And if your relationships with folks are merely transactional, they're going to remain that way. And I don't think that you're building anything. And so I think that I'm really interested in being part of a community. And you don't become part of a community by like sort of going up and saying, I'm at UVA now, so, you know, welcome me. That's just not the way that that happens. And so it's, it takes some patience, it takes some listening, and being receptive to that, not performing being in community, but actually wanting to be a part of the community that you say you want to be a part of.
Yeah. Everyone said something and that I think was important, and really Professor Mason started this, and he talked about immersing yourself in institutions. And I think that's one of the things that I think about a lot and I struggle with a lot, is these institutions, off grounds and on grounds, that I think also carry certain cultural memory and also carry alternative ways of being. When Professor Carson was talking about the art world, I thought about, you know, BSA and the creation of Black Culture Week. And that was very much about connecting Black students to the Black arts movement. And the Black arts movement was happy when these Black students got at white, you know, at some of these historically white universities, because Black Culture Week became a way to also pay, you know, independent artists, you know. And so I think that's the thing that I think about a lot and I worry about a lot too, especially in this pandemic moment, especially in this moment of economic crisis, planetary crisis, is the health of our local institutions in Charlottesville, but also within the community. And I think that's one of the things that, you know, I hope that students are also attentive to, just the health of our local institutions. For example, I'll take, you know, BSA, when they, you know, released those demands and the historic demands, and it was all beautiful. But I hope people really know the history of the institutions that made that possible. When we got that, not the 1987 Audacious Faith, but the 2000 Audacious Faith, I'm gonna just say this. There was a lot of people in the local community and around the nation who had to be called in order just to get that document. And so sometimes I even thought about in that moment, what does it mean to kind of spread a document and people don't understand the context, the institutional context in which that document was created, but also preserved. And I'm talking about in the basement of old AAA when BSA kept those records and said, no, library, we'll give it to you when we think you're ready and we know that you'll preserve it. So there's also been a kind of cultural, the keepers of the tradition have also been the institutions. And so that gets to this question of why I think it's important that, you know, we are individuals, but we are also individuals that are made by institutions. And I think, you know, and I would want to have more conversations with Professor Hawkins just about this, is like, when we say we're in it but not of it, you know, that is true, but like, what's our relationship perhaps to these institutions or to these student groups or to these outside organizations that kind of blur the line between the university and the community? How do we also maintain, you know, like, there's a cultural history that you could write about Black UVA and Charlottesville through Willie Salon on Elliewood. you know, which is no longer there. And so when I originally said, is anti-racist teaching, you know, capacious enough to carry all of this, what about the health of our institutions? That's what I'm talking about too, the ways in which sometimes a focus on certain things will have you ignoring other things. But I'll stop there. But like, yeah, the institutions, the health of the institutions that you preserve as students, as community members, you know, like, to me, all of those things are important.
You've all been so gracious with your time already this evening, and I know WashUs probably have pressing questions, so we'll probably cap it at a few questions if you would all take a couple questions from the audience. If people want to raise their hands, I'll just raise on you, call on you in order that you raise your hands. Kiwi, do you want to start with your question?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Kiwi, a member of the WASH. Really great to have you guys here today. It means a lot, and what you've talked about so far speaks a lot to like my experience at UVA, and it's really great to hear that echoed among the faculty here too. And so one of the things I am curious about is your stances on progress and moving forward. And the utility of trying to move the needle forward at UVA. I mean, when I heard that, you know, the amount of Black students at UVA has actually gone down since the 90s, that there's less African American students, let alone not more, that struck me as a very hard fact to swallow. So I'm curious, like, what do you think it takes to make real difference, not like beyond performative like we've been saying, but what actions actually make a difference? Is it recruiting from like historically African American high schools? Is it like studying this history in a different way? Like, what actually makes the makeup look different or the situation different at UVA?
I'm be very brief because I want to contextualize the Black enrollment. It has gone down, but I should note that it has gone up and it's been sort of stagnant the past really 5 to 6 years. And so it has not been at the level of decline that it once was. And I just say that to say, I also think that speaking out against this issue, and you really begin to hear people talk about it in 2010, 2011, I think people started talking about it a little too late. So I just want to say that it has been stagnant, and I think we have to be honest about that. It's a nationwide thing. So when I was at Temple in the 90s, it was 23% African American. It's 12% now. So this trend of declining Black enrollment at state universities, and that gets to also questions around class. We know that the Black middle class is also not fully recovered from the recession of 2008. So as tuition continues to rise, what communities is that rising tuition, you know, really hurting? Those people who maybe won't qualify for financial aid, but paying, say, if you're from Atlanta or Houston, $50,000 in tuition is just like really tough. You know, so I also think that it becomes a way to think about the dynamics of race, but also the dynamics of class. And so I think we have to raise these issues and also push the administration, for example, when they say, well, students won't, you know, questions around belonging. So did people feel like they belonged more in 1993 than they do now? That could be, the answer could be yes. But I'm just saying, how do we raise questions around affordability, like college affordability? I think that's important. I just wanted to say
that. Okay, and I think that what I want to say is really brief as well, which and it has nothing, I don't know if it offers anything substantial to like the actual, like as an answer to the question, but a question about the question, and that is how to, like, what is it about a narrative of progress that we find, like, what is it that we get from that? And I think that, like, maybe even asking what we're asking for, because I think that universities are really good at articulating whatever happens as, like, in some way as progress. And so then, like, what ends up happening is someone, I remember there was a sociologist who asked this question about, he said, well, don't you think it's better now for Black people than it was in 1955? And that's a weird question to me, because the premise, like, is so fundamentally flawed that like if I take it seriously, then I would probably say yes. But like what is missed in that question is that if I'm saying that like that Black folks are catching hell today, and you're saying that the hell that Black folks caught in 1955 was a worse kind of hell, then like essentially you've made me admit to being in a better hell and have not offered anything about like how we end hellish conditions. And so I'm always, it's like my hesitance with progress is because I think that that's an American way of telling history. And it always says that, or like a way that America tells its history, and it always says that right now is better than everything that happened before now. And because of that, then we can't question now related to the past, or we shouldn't be questioning now related to the past. And so it's just always like it's like there's a flag that's raised all the time that makes me want to ask more about the question, or what it is that we're trying to get from the question. And so if any students that I've had probably have heard me say this precise thing before, but that's all I wanted to say. It's not a response. I promise you I'm not offering that as a response.
What a great way to contextualize, what progress even means, to define progress in an American way, and what that looks like for different communities. And Paige, do you want to go ahead with the next question?
So I think it was Professor Hawkins that mentioned this, and I think Professor Harold talked about it as well. There's this kind of ruling ideology at UVA, and there's a way of thinking about things that you're taught as you go through classes here, and it's very deliberate. And it kind of plays into this, if you want to get a job, like I'm a low-income student, if you want to get a job, if you want to be successful, if you want to graduate out of the income level you were born into, you have to kind of move into this ideology and find some congruency with it. What is your advice, as, professors who have kind of pushed against this ruling ideology to resist it? Like as students, what can we do actively to resist falling into these like confines and trying to find the sense of congruency with a system that is inherently oppressive?
So I think I'm trying to think out loud about the answer, which I guess we're all doing, thinking out loud, about the question you asked in relation to this notion about that Professor Harold brought up when I talked about institutions. Like I said, I feel really emotional about these topics we've been talking about. And I feel like I'm not being very coherent, but like one of the things that I think, given my own experience in academia and undergrad at a, small liberal arts university, Rice University, and then graduate school at a large state university, University of Oklahoma, and then being at a small, particular Christian liberal arts college, that Wheaton College, that is predominantly white and has that an evangelical flair even, and then being here. I think one of the things that my own journey has pointed to, and I don't know how to talk about this without personalizing it, so forgive the reference to personal story, but like I am a social scientist who believes institutions are quite valuable. Historically, we know in political science that Black churches and Black religious institutions have been key repositories, not just platforms for the civil rights movement, but beyond that, one scholar calls them incubators of civic skills. Where did I learn to speak? Like I had to memorize Bible verses and recite them, in Bible school, right? And so the importance of institutions notwithstanding, I certainly believe certain institutions need to die. Some of them were formed from within. And so I think academia is a place that absolutely needs to be reformed, and UVA as an institution. And then there are people who are supposed to be revolutionaries from without. And so as I think about my place in academia, I'm very humbled, right? I'm very humbled. But yes, I carry my colonial trauma into an institution that continues to traumatize me. And every day I'm trying to work out, what does it mean to be an authentic human in the midst of an institution that is literally killing my body? It means I won't let it kill my soul. It means that that it's literally a privilege to teach you all. Because I get emotional. I get emotional about it because I love it so much. And then I live in this tension of this place that is literally killing me. And knowing that it's what made my heart sing. But also knowing that what saves me literally is salvific, is the perspective of the most oppressed people that we don't even see on the outside of the pinnacles like the ivory tower. That's what makes me more human. And I love academia. I love assigning my students hard books and giving them hard tests, and then spending 2 weeks working on the left side of our brain, making playlists like Obama. I'm teaching race in the Obama presidency, and seeing how difficult it is for them to engage another part of them, because what I really want is to teach you to be embodied people who engage these institutions but are never at rest. So how I teach you is to become someone who isn't lulled into the lie that this is it. Every institution wants your money, including churches, including the ones that are doing nonprofit work and all that stuff. But that's not the sum of who you are. And I can't separate that kind of human development of human capital and social capital. I don't need to teach you how to make profits. UVA does that quite well. But what I would love to teach you to be is prophets in the general sense of speaking truth to power wherever you are. And if this all, like I said, if all my students learn from me is how to see people, hear people, and especially see the most oppressed and be willing to submit to their authority, which, like I said, there's some virtue in showing up to work every day and not going apeshit crazy against a system that is literally killing your body every day. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. That's what I teach about. And how do I remain human? And how do I keep my soul? Like I said, I look at your faces every day, and I have to keep in check the power that this institution has over me. And so if I get tenure again, great. But if I don't, I'll be okay, right? So I'm living the contradiction, and I try to be very honest about the contradiction that it is. Because it's existential, it is life and death. So that's what I meant. And that's what my hope is for you. That as you press into who you are and who you are becoming, and I just use the Black vernacular, who you be and who you're becoming, because it's all about the essence. That's how you become a good student. That's how you figure out, like, when you're in an institution that is literally life-sucking. This is how our economies change. This is how CEOs go from making 20 times the average worker in 1970 to 720 times the average worker today. What's that? So a revolution at UVA could look like a revolution of like values, not in the like Republican flag values, but family values, but in the revolution of like, who are we? And what do we want to bequeath to the future? To the future UVA students, you can have 50% Black professors and the values will be the same. It's not about the color of the professors, it's about who you're going to be. And if the values were different, yes, we would have more. So it's both and, right? It's both and. So.
All right, Professor Hawkins has me tearing up on a regular basis. I genuinely can't thank you all enough for your time tonight. I feel like you all took me to church tonight, and it was exactly what I needed. I think every single person here took away a lot from this conversation. So thank you all so much for how generous you've been with your time. I don't see any more questions, so I think with that we can wrap up the Zoom call. I want to thank you all again. Thank you all for inviting us to think out loud about these things.
Thank you very much.
And I honor you, students, for keeping on keeping on. It's a hard time. I see you.
Thanks, and peace to all y'all.
Colleagues, good to see y'all.
Likewise. Peace.
Peace.
Thank you.